Before the first shells fell, someone pulled a plug under the Atlantic. In August 1914, British ships surged to sea not to fire, but to cut Germany's telegraph cables, silencing its financial voice to the world. Stock exchanges shut, gold vanished behind vault doors, and the war's first battles were fought on ledgers and in back rooms. This wasn't only a clash of empires. It was a contest of balance sheets, supply chains, and credit. The most decisive theater wasn't always in mud and trenches. It was in the quiet arithmetic of who could pay, for how long, and with whose savings. You're watching Hidden Finance, the place where we uncover the money behind history's greatest turning points. If you're ready for the story of how a world war became a world of numbers, credits, and invisible blockades, you're in the right place. Subscribe, follow, and stay with us, because the past keeps its secrets in the margins of ledgers, and we read margins for a living. To understand why World War I unfolded as a financial strategy, we have to start a few decades before it began. By the early 1900s, the world was wrapped in the golden wire of the classical gold standard, a system that made money convertible to gold and trade relatively predictable. London was the beating heart of global finance, the city, where sterling and trust governed commerce from Buenos Aires to Bombay. Capital flowed easily across borders. Insurance, shipping, railways, and the telegraph stitched economies together. This was prosperity, but also fragility, a world ordered by credit lines that could be severed in an instant. Germany, newly unified and industrially hungry, built factories, ships, and railways with astonishing speed. Banks like Deutsche Bank and Dresdner financed heavy industry. Scientific management and cartels yielded steel, chemicals, and confidence. France channeled its savings into Russian railways and bonds, making Paris the banker of the Tsar. Britain, confident and overextended, sustained a global empire built on cheap credit and naval power. And everywhere, the belief persisted that a war would be short because disruption would be too costly, an illusion that would die in the first winter. When war broke out in August 1914, the financial system convulsed. The New York Stock Exchange slammed its doors for 4 months to prevent a panic and gold drain. In London, the Treasury created emergency currency small Bradbury notes and quietly discouraged gold withdrawals, while guaranteeing crucial acceptance houses to prevent a cascade of failures. Germany suspended gold convertibility and mobilized its central bank to extend credit, while creating the War Raw Materials Department under Walter Rathenau to ration strategic supplies. Across the continent, banks took holidays, governments promised stability, and the gold standard, the backbone of pre-war confidence, fractured. Britain moved quickly to turn finance into a weapon. On the war's first days, it cut Germany's transatlantic cables, forcing messages to travel through British-controlled routes. Censorship and intelligence were now fiscal tools, intercepting commercial deals, insurance contracts, and market sentiment. The Admiralty's blockade morphed into an economic chokehold, policed by navicerots and contraband lists that starved German industry of nitrates, metals, and food. Trading with the enemy statutes blacklisted firms that dealt with the Central Powers, and the Treasury monitored foreign exchange to tighten the screw. This wasn't only a naval campaign, it was the construction of a financial dam. How to pay for a war no one could afford. Berlin made a fateful bet. German leaders issued vast war bonds Kriegsanleihen, urging citizens to lend in the belief that victory would bring indemnities to settle the bill. The slogan was blunt: the enemy will pay. France and Britain also borrowed heavily, rallying savers with patriotic posters, street parades, and new tax measures to widen the base. But their lifeline ran beyond their borders, to a neutral America with factories, food, and cash. By 1915, the United States became the Allies' indispensable quartermaster, and the conduit ran through Wall Street, J.P. Morgan & Co., acting as the official purchasing agent for Britain and France, orchestrated an enormous syndicate to buy everything from wheat to rails, from copper to cartridges. The Anglo-French loan of 1915 $500 million signaled a new reality. New York was no longer just a market. It was a global banker. American farms and factories boomed. Gold poured into U.S. vaults, and the Federal Reserve, born in 1913, cut its teeth stabilizing a world at war without ever firing a shot. Neutrality looked a lot like credit. On the home fronts, governments transformed citizens into financiers. Posters showed children asking parents to buy bonds for my future. Churches held Liberty Loan Sundays. Theater stopped shows for bond pitches. Celebrities and sports heroes led parades for subscriptions. Savings campaigns turned thrift into service, linking money to morale. Taxes climbed. Britain's income tax spread deeper. France lifted levies, and America's Revenue Act of 1917 made modern progressive taxation a permanent pillar, while inflation quietly ate into wages, the unspoken tax of every war. By 1916, the Western Front became a grinder, and the war turned industrial. Germany launched the Hindenburg Program, organizing labor, commandeering factories, and standardizing production to squeeze more from less. But shortages bit hard, not least because the blockade constrained imports and fertilizers, pushing agriculture into crisis and causing the turnip winter of 1916-1917. Britain, too, retooled Lloyd George's Ministry of Munitions, rationed materials, capped profits, and managed contracts to keep shells and guns flowing. Total war was not only mass mobilization of soldiers, but mass mobilization of spreadsheets. The Sea War made financial negotiations feel like naval campaigns. Britain's control of shipping insurance and freight rates meant neutrality came with conditions. To trade, one passed through Sterling's toll booth. German U-boats attempted to reverse the calculus by menacing Allied shipping, hoping to starve Britain as Britain starved Germany. The cost of marine insurance soared with each torpedo's splash, and cargoes rerouted through safer, more expensive paths. Every sunk ship wasn't just lost steel, it was lost credit, lost confidence, and a bond coupon that would never be paid. Then 1917 cracked the world. In Russia, two revolutions toppled the Tsar and then the provisional government. The Bolsheviks repudiated Tsar's debts, erasing the savings of millions of French households who had funded the Tsar's railways and mines. Treasury ledgers shuttered in Paris and London. Not only had an ally fallen, but creditors had been taught that bonds were soldiers too. On the Western Front, morale staggered under mutinies and carnage. At sea, U-boat warfare escalated toward catastrophe. The war needed a new balance, and it got one. In April 1917, the United States entered the war, and with it entered the full power of modern public finance. Treasury Secretary William G. McAdoo launched Liberty Loans with unmatched fervor, turning bond drives into national rituals. The Federal Reserve coordinated with the Treasury to keep interest rates low enough to sustain massive emissions, while the War Finance Corporation underwrote industries deemed essential. Taxes ramped sharply. The dollar became both sword and shield. The United States hadn't only joined a war, it had joined as the banker of victory. All along, one side believed indemnities would work, and the other believed institutions would. Germany had financed itself with the expectation of triumph and transfer war paid by someone else. Britain, France, and now America had built machinery, blockades, bond markets, exchanges, bureaucracies that turned economies into weapons and weapons into debts they intended, somehow, to manage. The difference mattered. Because in 1918, when Germany gambled on an offensive before American strength could fully arrive, it found itself fighting the arithmetic of steel, wheat, credit, and gasoline and losing. The armistice halted the guns, but not the obligations. Europe emerged with mountains of debt, price levels distorted by years of inflation, and currencies unmoored from gold's old anchor. Britain owed billions to the United States. France's landscape and factories were scarred and covered by promissory notes. Germany's finances were exhausted, its currency swollen with paper, its savings sacrificed to the Reich's war loan machine. The war ended on the battlefield, but it continued in the accounts. At Versailles, the victors faced the bill and tried to write the future if it were a balance sheet. Reparations were set in 1921 at 130 billion gold marks, a number meant to ring with justice, but heavy with impossibility. John Maynard Keynes, who had watched the negotiations from the inside, warned that the transfer problem, the practical difficulty of turning German output into foreign currency for payments, could break the system. Interlinked debts hardened positions. How could France forgive what it owed America if Germany did not pay France? Europe's financial plumbing captured it in a loop. The loop soon became a circle. The Dawes Plan of 1920 stabilized Germany with foreign loans, largely from American banks that financed reparations, which paid allies, which serviced debts to Washington. Money flowed across the Atlantic and back again, a carousel of hope spinning on short-term credit. As long as Wall Street lent, Europe could breathe. When the Great Depression struck and lending contracted, the carousel snapped. The Young Plan became a memory. Moratoriums appeared, and defaults rippled through the system. Germany's own post-war path shows how wartime choices echo far beyond armistice. Wartime money creation deformed the mark. Reparations pressure, political upheaval, and the occupation of the Ruhr led to a break the hyperinflation of 1923, where prices doubled in days and savings evaporated. Stabilization came with the Rentenmark, and later the Reichsmark, but the social damage had been done. In Austria-Hungary's successor states, currencies likewise crumbled, and the trauma of financial chaos carved itself into politics. A war financed on hope had become a peace overwhelmed by arithmetic. Britain tried to reassert the old order by returning to the gold standard at pre-war parity in 1925, an act of faith twice as heavy as its intention. That meant deflation at home, unemployment in industrial towns, and a decade of struggle to defend a symbol. The city remained powerful, but New York had quietly taken the center chair. The United States emerged as the world's principal creditor and, increasingly, its financial organizer, a reality born not from isolation, but from engagement, first as neutral supplier, then as ally, finally as banker. The Great War also built states that never unlearned their war finance. Taxes reached deeper and stayed there. Income tax went from experiment to backbone. Central banks, once timid guardians of gold, became partners of treasury, masters of liquidity, and, in time, managers of demand. Ministries of munitions and supply pioneered procurement, statistics, and industrial policy. If total war demanded the integration of economy and state, the peace inherited that integration as routine governance. Even the tactics of finance became strategic orthodoxy. The British wartime blockade was the ancestor of modern sanctions. The blacklists and contraband lists foreshadowed today's restricted entities. Cutting cables taught the power of controlling information, today mirrored in payments networks, correspondent banking, and the soft pressure of compliance. When governments freeze reserves, target banks, or deny access to messaging systems, they are using tools conceived in an era when telegraph sparks determined whose cargo could sail. War made finance a battlefield. Peace kept it as a theater of power. If you look closely at 1914 to 1918, you see not chaos but a plan imperfect, improvised, but deeply strategic. Germany's plan was victory first, payment later. The Allies was credit first, endurance always. Both sides grasped that a modern war is a problem of logistics and liquidity, how to turn coal into steam into shells, and how to convert promises into trust into provisions. Citizens were not just soldiers and workers. They were creditors, taxpayers, and targets of propaganda that transformed thrift into patriotism. The trenches may have defined the image. The bond drives defined the outcome, and the echoes haven't faded. Today's dollar system traces its roots to those war years, when American finance replaced British credit as the global scaffold. International institutions, central bank cooperation, and the idea that markets themselves can be a weapon all gained weight in that era. When we witness sanctions regimes, reserve freezes, and fights over energy payments, we are seeing a modern version of a century-old playbook. If World War I taught anything, it's that wars are won as much by solvency as by strategy. So why wasn't World War I just a war? Because from day one, it was a calculation: who controls the cables, the shipping lanes, the insurance, the banks, the gold, the printing press, and ultimately, the belief that tomorrow's promise will be honored today. The generals fought for ground, the financiers fought for time. In the end, the side that turned patience and credit into ammunition outlasted the side that promised victory would pay for itself. History remembers the armistice at 11 o'clock. Finance remembers the interest that kept ticking at 12. This is Hidden Finance, where we reveal the money behind power. If this changed how you see the Great War, join us, subscribe, and share with someone who still thinks history happened only on the battlefield. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface. The biggest battles are often fought in the smallest print. The ledger decided it. In 1914 to 1918, the most decisive front line ran through the balance sheet.